Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope everyone is doing well. So, today we are going to continue reading from Provoked by Scott Horton, who is an amazing researcher, writer, and historian. And I will leave his show linked in the description. This is his newest book, Provoked. We're on chapter 1, part 2. So, let's do this. NATO's Warner. In a speech in May 1990, Manfred Warner, the German Secretary General of NATO, seemed to back away from the special military zone, reassuring the Russians that the primary task of the next decade will be to build a new European security structure to include the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations. The Soviet Union will have an important role to play in the construction of such a system, he added. If you consider the current predicament of the Soviet Union, which has practically no allies left, then you can understand its justified wish to not be forced out of Europe. Emphasizing that the USSR had nothing to fear from the West in the new post-Cold War era, Warner said this will also be true of United Germany and NATO. The very fact that we are ready not to deploy NATO troops beyond the territory of the Federal Republic gives the Soviet Union firm security guarantees. So if anybody knows anything about Russia, they're like literally from this time period to now, that's all they ever talk about is that they want to have security guarantees put in place for themselves and their country. And they're just completely ignored and acted like they're acting crazy. And then everybody acts like they're the aggressors and they want to go to war with everyone when they're just like, hey, we'd like some security guarantees. Can we have diplomatic talks? In Copenhagen on June 7, 1991, NATO passed a resolution declaring they would neither attempt to gain one-sided advantage from the changing situation in Europe nor draw new dividing lines in the continent. This statement was invoked by the Russians on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In 2015, former Russian Foreign Minister Yevgeny Permakov published his memoir on the NATO expansion meetings at the crossroads. The National Security Archive posted an important excerpt. Permakov's catalog of the Bush senior administration's broken promises, which included all of the above, plus an assurance or two by French President Francois Mitterrand, knowingly misleading. The key to understanding the situation is that H.W. Bush and his cabinet were lying to the Soviets, later the Russians, before President Bill Clinton came into Washington. His administration would then continue to do so into the new millennium. In April 1990, Bush met with Shorvanats and led him to believe that he agreed with the Soviets that the CSCE should now take the lead in a pan-European security arrangement in place of the two former blocs. I want to contribute to stability and the creation of a Europe whole and free, or as you call it, a common European home, an idea that is very close to our own. On May 4th, Baker reported on his meeting with Shorvanats to President Bush, I used your speech and our recognition of the need to adopt NATO politically and militarily and to develop CSCE to reassure Shorvanats that the process would not yield winners and losers. Instead, it would produce a new legitimate European structure, one that would be inclusive, not exclusive. Shorvanats had responded positively, saying our discussion with the new European architecture was compatible with much of their thinking, though their thinking was still being developed. Even though the White House had decided to cease any talk about future limits on NATO expansion, Baker again on May 18, 1990, told Gorbachev in response to a suggestion of an accusation from the premier, before saying a few words about the German issue, I wanted to emphasize our policies are not aimed at separating Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union. We had that policy before, he continued, but today we are interested in building a stable Europe and doing it together with you. When Gorbachev asked, what is the purpose of NATO now? Good question. Baker assured him it was no longer about keeping the Soviets out, but the Germans down, again threatening that an independent Germany could get its own nuclear or even biological or chemical weapons if not subsumed into America's military order, while promising to build pan-European security structures over the long term. Baker again emphasized the danger of having a separate neutral Germany. When Gorbachev objected that adding Germany to the alliance would strengthen NATO, Baker answered, in the immediate short term, maybe. However, we are currently talking about a change, about adapting NATO and giving it a more political nature. He told the Soviet premier, we recognize the importance of reducing the West German army. We understand your concerns and are taking them into account. I don't think we are trying to get unilateral benefits. He again promised that NATO will undergo an evolution to become more of a political organization, and that we are making an effort in various forums to ultimately transform the CSCE into a permanent institution that would become an important cornerstone of a new Europe. This institution would include all European countries, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Baker repeatedly used the phrase from Vancouver to Vladivostok to describe this future joint security structure. As Brent Scowcroft later wrote, this gave Gorbachev the opportunity to argue to his Politburo that NATO had been transformed and was no longer a threat. You guys see what's going on here? This is crazy. After proposing a possible France-like special status for Germany within NATO, or even non-aligned status, Gorbachev suggested the USSR would try to join the Western Alliance too. After all, you say that NATO is not directed against us, that it is just a security structure that is adapting to the new reality. So we will propose to join NATO. Baker changed the subject. Bush also strongly implied to the Premier Gorbachev on May 31st that the CSCE, which already included the USSR, would now be the primary security organization in a new exclusive Europe, replacing NATO, which, again, would be turned into a political organization. Of course, we have no intention, even in our thoughts, to harm the Soviet Union in any fashion, Bush told him. That's why we are speaking in favor of German unification in NATO without ignoring the wider context of the CSCE, taking the traditional economic ties between the two German states into consideration. Such a model, in our view, corresponds to the Soviet interests as well. Bush also said a conventional forces in Europe treaty was the gateway to developing a new political and security structure in Europe. He said he did not want winners and losers, only to see the USSR integrated into the new Europe. Did they do that? Or have they treated Russia like the redheaded stepchild for the last several decades? Thatcher also played her part in reassuring Gorbachev about the less threatening role NATO was to play in the new Europe. We must find ways to give the Soviet Union confidence that its security would be assured, she told him. CSCE could not be an umbrella for all this, as well as being the forum which brought the Soviet Union fully into the discussion about the future of Europe. In July, after Gorbachev's final discussion with Kohl before reunification, Bush again implied agreement with the Premier's concept of a common European home in which the USSR would be part of any new security agreement, particularly under the CSCE. The Soviet Union confrontation is over. Working together will make a peaceful post-war world. I hope you have seen the transformation of the NATO alliance and hope this is the way it was read in the Soviet Union. Bush told Gorbachev, we conveyed the idea of an expanded, stronger CSCE with new institutions, and with the USSR, we can share and be part of the new Europe. Sherfinson notes how disingenuous this was. The administration was promising to sideline NATO in favor of a new Soviet Union inclusive security arrangement while privately planning for an American-dominant post-Cold War system and taking steps that would attain this objective. He continued, but badly stated, the United States floated an operative grand design for post-war Europe in discussions with the Soviets in 1990, while creating a system dominated by the United States. For example, in July 1990, Secretary Baker referred to the inevitable expansion of NATO when he said that the CSCE serve as a halfway house for the governments who want out of the Warsaw Pact but can't join NATO, NEC. As Sherfinson politely put it, given that the U.S. policymakers were simultaneously promising to emphasize NATO's political nature so as to render NATO acceptable to the Soviet Union, Baker's comments suggested the dual nature of the U.S. strategy. Baker had even warned President Bush that the real risk to NATO is CSCE CE. The latter was to serve as a red herring only. Just as Germany began reunification that October, an interagency review stated that the key U.S. interest was to ensure that NATO remains the central pillar of Europe's security architecture. A few days later, senior National Security Council officials agreed on a policy of building up NATO to prevent the CSCE from becoming the center of new Europe security structures. They had to guarantee that NATO would remain the central institution in providing for Europe's defense. Why? Why do we have to do that? The State Department counselor Robert Zoellick said that if they wanted to give an impression of movement regarding new structures and offered Gorbachev some things to make him more comfortable with the process of the reunification of Germany. Just a few days after reunification was complete, the White House was already talking about Eastern Europe NATO's readiness to contemplate their future membership. In July 1991, the Russian Supreme Soviet delegation reported back to the newly elected president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, that NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner was dead set against the expansion of the alliance to include Poland, Romania, Hungary, or Czechoslovakia, which was, we should not allow the isolation of the USSR from the European community. The Russians said that one has to emphasize that democratic changes in Russia, the largest republic of the USSR, have the potential to exert a serious impact on the reformation of NATO, where political cooperation is becoming the main function. They concluded, in principle, they are ready for active cooperation in the sphere with the USSR and the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. So that's what it was called back then. Now it's just called like the Russian Federation because it's not all that anymore. They had bought it. Before the Soviet Union was all the way dead on December 19, 1991, Yeltsin reiterated Gorbachev's query about Russia creating a close association with or even joining NATO. See, they wanted to join NATO even back then, and then even Putin tried to ask if they could join NATO and join the West and be all friends and stuff, and they like basically laughed at him. So like when I said all that before, I like this book says that it's true, okay? This book has footnotes with legitimate documents. Okay, where was I? Yeltsin reiterated Gorbachev's query about Russia creating a close association with or even joining NATO, at least as a long-term political goal. Baker changed the subject again. In short, the only reason Gorbachev and the Soviets were so cooperative on withdrawal from Germany and the reunification of its halves, much less their further withdrawal of military forces from the rest of the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Republic states, was entirely predicated on Bush, Baker, Gates, Kohl, Genscher, Thatcher, Major, and the rest assurances that they would not take advantage of the situation, especially by expanding their military alliance eastward, and the U.S. administration was deliberately deceitful in leading them to believe it. As Sherfinson noted, ultimately, if Europe was to be linked by a new set of security institutions, while NATO was militarily constrained and had an increasingly political focus, then formal non-expansion guarantees were superfluous. One may object that the deals were struck with the USSR, not the post-Soviet Russia, and argue that countries that were still Soviet republics or in the Warsaw Pact could not have been up for consideration anyway, but that is incorrect. As shown above, nations such as Poland and Hungary were brought up by name in the promises on NATO expansion in the early 1990s, along with more general references to Eastern Europe, while the Warsaw Pact was not dissolved until March 1991. Also, they had signed the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, which guaranteed the right to be or not to be a party to treaties of alliance, and Gorbachev was already raising the question of even the USSR itself joining. State Department warning. The State Department drew up a new strategy paper on the future NATO in October 1990. They recommended denying membership of new Eastern European nations since the U.S. could not really protect them and does not in any case wish to organize an anti-Soviet coalition whose frontier is the Soviet border. Yes. Also, these are people that you're now breaking up into weird that have been broken up into weird arbitrary lines, and they're all different ethnic groups, which is what caused all this disaster to happen that we're going to probably be reading about as we move through this book. Look, I'm going to be real honest with you guys. If I can't get people to subscribe or like, YouTube will literally send aliens to my house. Do you want me to be probed? I need you to like and to subscribe. Thank you. Such a coalition would be perceived very negatively by the Soviets and could lead to a reversal of current positive trends in Eastern Europe and the USSR. They thought it of the highest importance to ascertain carefully how relations with these emerging democracies, combined with the new Western relationship with the Soviet Union, could be managed to avoid any hint of superpower continuum, anti-Sovietism, or Eastern European containment. Saving the USSR. Chicken Kiev. They may not have wanted them in NATO, but President H.W. Bush tried to save the Soviet Union. Really? He, Secretary Baker, and the National Security Advisor Scowcroft thought it would be preferable if Moscow could control the Soviet republics, mostly over concerns about the USSR's nuclear weapons stockpile. In 1990, Deputy National Security Advisor Gates had urged KGB Director Khrushchev to develop a new federation as soon as possible to prevent large-scale ethnic-based secession movements in Eastern Europe and presumably Central Asia. They supported Gorbachev's proposed new Union Treaty, which would have replaced the USSR with a federation including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. On August 1st, 1991, President Bush gave his infamous Chicken Kiev speech, as New York Times columnist William Shafire called it. The address was written by Bush's National Security Council staffer Condoleezza Rice. In the speech, Bush warned against Ukrainian agitation for independence from Russia on anything but the Kremlin's deliberate timeline, telling their Central Committee, "We will not try to pick winners and losers in political competitions between republics or between republics and the center. That's your business. That's not the business of the United States of America." He added, "Some people have urged the United States to choose between supporting President Gorbachev and supporting independent-minded leaders throughout the USSR. I consider this a false choice." He further warned that freedom is not the same as independence, and that his administration will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. They will not aid those who promote a suicidal nationalism based upon ethnic hatred. The new Union Treaty was to be signed on August 20th, but in reaction against communist hardliners' failed coup of August 18th through the 22nd, which had been heroically put down by new President Boris Yeltsin with the help of tens of thousands of civilian Muscovites who came out to support him. Ukraine ignored Bush's advice and declared independence on August 24th. On December 1st, 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence, including with totals above 80% in the favor of the predominantly ethnic Russian eastern and southern regions of Kharkov, the Donbass, and Odessa. Boy, I bet they regretted that decision in the future. Leonid Kharkov, newly elected leader of Ukraine, switched sides and relabeled everything communist as nationalist instead. Much of the same thing took place in Kazakhstan with former first secretary of the new nation's Communist Party, Nursultan Nazarbayev, and with Ashur Karayev in Kyrgyzstan. After that, what was left of the Soviet Union was finally doomed. The Baltics and Uzbekistan declared independence a few days later. Yeltsin brought the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus to a meeting in the latter country, where on December 8th they signed the Belovezh Accords to finally dissolve what was left of the Soviet Empire and replace it with the powerless Commonwealth of Independent States Trade Pact. The Ukrainian and Belarusian parliaments ratified the New Deal on December 10th and the Russian parliament on December 12th. Gorbachev signed, and the Soviet Communist red flag, with its yellow hammer and sickle, hatred symbol of totalitarian slavery, deprivation, and mass murder, was finally taken down from the Kremlin on Christmas Day, 1991. Bush's National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft confirmed this history. The aim was to liberate Eastern Europe, to get Soviet troops out of Eastern Europe. We thought that would really mark the end of the Cold War. It was not to destroy the Soviet Union. That was not our goal. It was rather to bring the Cold War to an end by getting their soldiers out of Eastern Europe. Well, what did you think would happen? Like these people. The man even sounded wistful for the old days and resentful of Yeltsin for wrecking the evil empire. What became clear to me was that Yeltsin was maneuvering so that Ukraine could be the proximate cause of the breakup of the Soviet Union, but he was just using them, almost completely, because it was the way Yeltsin could get rid of Gorbachev. The new Russian president made the old Soviet premier the leader of a political entity that no longer existed. Scowcroft mused, if there had not been that enmity, I think there still could have been some kind of Soviet Union today. He also wrote that it was painful to watch Yeltsin rip the Soviet Union brick by brick away from Gorbachev and then later transfer most of them to Russia. In the conception of the Bush senior administration, the Soviet republics, including the Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine, were all east of Eastern Europe. Okay, so they didn't consider them, they don't like them. These people that have been in control forever, and some of them are still around, like Lindsey Graham, they hate Slavs. They hate them. They want them all dead. They don't care even about the Ukrainians. They're happy that they're all dying. These people are sick, I'm telling you. All right, I'm going to start back. In the conception of the Bush senior administration, the Soviet republics, including Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine, were all east of Eastern Europe, though the U.S., which had never recognized Soviet sovereignty over the Baltics, did support independence for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia regardless. For all their scheming, they would have never considered extending NATO as far as Ukraine. As Bush and Scowcroft wrote in their joint memoir, we had to be careful not to handle this so precipitously that we encouraged the radical nationalists in Ukraine, we talked about that, and Russia, where there was considerable resistance to losing Ukraine and its 12 million ethnic Russians. And that's going to be a problem. That's why we're seeing what we're seeing today. Okay, because the western half of Ukraine hates the eastern part of Ukraine because they're Russian ethnically. And that's why they started bombing and shelling and killing civilians there in 2014. So the government of Ukraine was bombing and shelling its own civilians. The last thing we needed was a confrontation between the two. Though Bush was rightfully mocked for trying to hold the USSR together in this federation under the new treaty rather than favoring its outright destruction, this caution helped the Russian reformers see the fall of the regime through to the end without U.S. provoking unnecessary backlash against their effort. So he unintentionally helped to destroy it anyway. Bush's speech also hinted at potentially dangerous national forces in the Soviet Union, who could do themselves much more harm than good. Ambassador Matlock has written that Bush's denunciation of suicidal nationalism based on ethnic hatred was inspired by Georgian leader Zavad Sakardia's attacks on minorities in Soviet Georgia. So that's another thing. During this time period was all crazy. There was tons of terrorist attacks all in these areas in Russia. I'm sure that this book's going to get into it. And then there's all the civil wars that are going to break out that then like our government makes worse, and like arms, and it was really bad. People just pretend like they don't remember any of this stuff. I wasn't even that old and I remember all this stuff. To his credit, when Bush called and the coup plotters of August 1991 tried to connect him to acting President Gennady Yadkinov, he refused, saying he would only talk to Gorbachev. Avoiding Armageddon. Of course, the main reason the administration was interested in holding the republics together with Russia was concern over Soviet nuclear weapons, which were left behind in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan by the thousands. Would loose nukes hit the black market if Moscow gave up control? They determined that the risk was not worth it before events simply got out of hand with the commies' failed coup and the final unraveling of the empire. Though President Bush launched America's New World Order of attempted global hegemony and our 30-year catastrophic war in the Middle East and beyond, it should be noted that in one important way he handled the end of the Cold War in what could even be called heroic fashion. During his presidency, the U.S. signed multiple treaties with the Soviets and then the successor Russian Federation to drastically reduce conventional military forces, as well as both sides' stockpiles of nuclear weapons from tens of thousands to much lower totals we have today. Bush went so far as to make drastic unilateral cuts, including removing all nuclear weapons from U.S. surface ships, submarines, land-based naval aircraft, and taking American strategic bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles off their high alert posture. He did this simply in the hope that Gorbachev would also, where he could, since there was no time to draw out negotiations. It worked. Gorbachev announced on October 5th that the USSR would destroy all tactical nuclear warheads for artillery, land-based missiles, surface ships, and submarines. Bush also signed Senators Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar's Soviet Nuclear Threat Reduction Act that authorized American assistance in dismantling much of the former Soviet Union's nuclear weapons stockpile, and in the very last days of his presidency in the beginning of 1993, traveled to Moscow to sign the START II Nuclear Weapons Treaty and the new Chemical Weapons Convention as well. And I think we will end it there for today. Very, very interesting. Next chapter, it's the same chapter, but next session starts with Bosnia Begins. So that should be pretty interesting. Thank you guys for being here. I hope you enjoyed this reading of Provoked. Please check the description for links to Scott Horton's show, which is a really good, interesting show. And please don't forget to subscribe and like. I'm a small channel, so it really means a lot. And I will see you next time on The Eclectic Journalist.